Some places hold more than just memories. They hold secrets, buried under floorboards and packed into the soil. Tonight, we journey deep into the Appalachian wilderness. We're sharing 8 true accounts from people who wandered off the beaten path and found something waiting for them in the dark. These stories are a chilling reminder that some places are best left unexplored. Make sure to like and subscribe to Ghost Chronicles. Share this with a friend who loves a good scare, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, turn down the lights and listen closely. The sound began right under the floor, a slow, deliberate scrape, like a single fingernail testing the grain of the wood. It was a sound that didn't belong, not in the dead of the Appalachian night, and certainly not in a house that was supposed to be empty. The house had belonged to my grandmother, sat in a small clearing in Black Creek Hollow, a place so deep in the mountains you could feel the trees leaning in to listen. Growing up, I saw those woods as a fortress. My grandfather was the warden. He knew the language of his land. A snapped twig, a distant bird call, he'd hear it, nod, and take another sip of his coffee. He was a man who was never surprised, and as a kid, that made me feel invincible. But that feeling of safety is a fragile thing. It shatters like glass. My grandfather passed first. My grandmother followed a few years later. The house was left to the woods and to me. For over a decade, I pretended it wasn't my problem. I built a life in the city, a life of pavement and noise. But legal notices don't care about denial. They pile up, they force your hand, so last October I drove back. I hadn't been near that house in 10 years. The main road gave way to a vein of gravel. The gravel bled into a dirt path. Deep ruts flanked a high spine of raised dirt. My sedan was a joke out here. I had to ride the center ridge, praying I wouldn't hear the sickening scrape of metal on rock. The silence was absolute. No traffic. No power lines. Just the whisper of wind through pine. 3 nights, I told myself. It was the deal I'd made. 3 nights to sort through a lifetime of forgotten things. 3 nights to meet the notary and sign the land away. Then I could retreat to my world and let this place become a memory again. But some places don't let you forget. They wait, and they remember. The sun was bleeding out behind the ridge when I finally pulled into the clearing. The house looked tired. The porch roof sagged like a tired old animal. One of the floorboards had rotted away, leaving a gray, toothless grin in the wood. I had to step over it to reach the front door. The lock turned with a smooth, quiet click. Felt unnatural, as if the house had been expecting me. The air inside was thick. It smelled of dust, dried herbs, and a deeper, more unsettling scent. Like damp earth and something sickly sweet. The smell of slow decay. It was a smell that carried memories. Holidays around the old wood stove. My grandmother's quiet humming. My grandfather's boots caked in mud, standing by the back door. I stood in the doorway, letting the past wash over me. It felt like stepping into a photograph. I dropped my bag and began the work. The kitchen cabinets were a time capsule. Dishes sat behind brittle, yellowed contact paper. Her knitting basket was still by her favorite chair. The yarn was still threaded through the needles. A pale blue scarf, half finished. A project interrupted mid-thought. By the time the woods were fully dark, I had boxed up most of the kitchen. My phone, of course, was a useless brick. No service. I wandered from window to window, holding it up to the glass like a prayer. Finally, I caught a single flickering bar, just enough to text my sister. Made it. I ate a sandwich standing at the sink. I stared out the window into the black wall of the tree line. The trunks were so dense they seemed to merge into one. It gave me the same feeling I had as a kid. The unnerving sense that if you stared long enough, you might see something stare back. That night, sleep was a long time coming. The old house groaned and popped around me. Every sound was magnified in the oppressive quiet. I don't know what time it was when the noise woke me. It started under the floor. The slow scraping sound. I lay perfectly still, my heart a heavy drum against my ribs. It wasn't an animal. Animals scrabble and scratch. This was patient. Moved back and forth. A short rhythmic rasp. Then it would stop. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was a listening silence. Then a dull thump. Not a bump. A heavy, solid pressure from below. As if something was testing the floorboards for a weak point. I clenched the blankets in my fists. My mouth was so dry I couldn't swallow. For an hour, the pattern repeated. Scrape, pause, press over and over. When it finally stopped, I didn't dare move. I waited for the first pale hint of dawn to bleed through the curtains. The next morning, I was exhausted. I forced myself outside. I checked the crawl space vents. They were undisturbed. No broken screens. No tracks in the dirt. My city brain scrambled for an explanation. A raccoon. A loose pipe. I told myself it was just the house settling. I knew I was lying. All day I packed. But I couldn't stop thinking about the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The one leading under the house. My grandmother always kept a heavy rug over it. Now it was bare. Every time I walked past, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had this irrational fear that I would look down and see it, just slightly ajar. The second night, I didn't even try to sleep. I just lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The hours ticked by in suffocating silence. My eyelids grew heavy. Just as I started to drift, it began again. But this time, it was personal. The scraping wasn't random. It was tracking me. It moved along the floor, stopping directly beneath my bed. The boards under me creaked. I could feel the vibration through the mattress. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. It felt like it was searching for a way in. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking. No signal, of course. The scraping stopped. The silence was absolute. And then I heard the voice. It came from the floorboards. It was a wet, guttural whisper. The words were not a language I knew. It was the sound of a throat that had forgotten how to speak. A sick, bubbling sound. I didn't think. I just moved. I threw myself out of bed and ran. I reached the top of the stairs and my blood went cold. The trapdoor in the kitchen floor was rising. It lifted slowly, not creaking, but with a wet, tearing sound. Like it was being pulled up through something thick and heavy. Something pale pushed through the gap. It wasn't a hand. It was a long, white limb, thin as a bone. It was covered in black soil and what looked like wet leaves. It reached out, fingers uncurling, and placed a palm flat on the kitchen floor. I bolted. I flew down the stairs, my feet tangling in the runner. I slammed through the front door and sprinted into the clearing. The cold, wet grass slapped at my ankles. I didn't stop until I hit the tree line. I pressed my back against the rough bark of a pine, fumbling with my phone. Still nothing. I crouched down, trying to silence my ragged breaths. Then I heard the front door slam open. A heavy, wet footstep hit the porch. Then another. It wasn't walking. It was dragging itself across the yard. The sound was slow, but it was getting closer. It stopped. I had the terrifying feeling that it was listening, that it could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut. My cheek pressed against the cold bark. The footsteps moved again. They wandered the edge of the clearing. I heard a sound like wet, labored breathing. It drifted to the far side of the yard, then fell silent. I stayed there until the sky turned from black to gray. When there was enough light to see, I crept back to the house. My legs felt hollow. The front door was wide open. Inside, the kitchen was silent. The trapdoor was closed. I didn't go upstairs. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and the one box I had packed. I didn't care about the rest. I walked out, got in my car, and drove. I drove until the trees thinned and the sun was fully in the sky. I sold the land to a developer a month later. I never told them what was sleeping under the house, or that I was the one who woke it up. It wore my mother's voice, a perfect imitation, right down to the little tremor she had when she was worried. It was a sound that didn't belong in the deep woods of Fox Hollow. A sound that had no business being there, because my mother had been gone for 10 years. My cousin Mason never cared for old stories. To him, they were just ghost tales, cooked up to keep kids from wandering off. And in eastern Kentucky, there were plenty of stories to ignore, especially about Fox Hollow. My granddad used to talk about it. He'd sit on his porch watching the sun set over the ridges. He'd tell me about hunters who walked up those old service trails and simply vanished. Their trucks would be found days later. Their gear would be neatly packed. But the men themselves, the trail would just end. No tracks, no sign of a struggle. Those ridges swallow folks whole, he'd say. And the way he said it, his eyes fixed on the tree line, made it sound less like a saying and more like a fact. But Mason didn't believe in facts he hadn't seen for himself. He got it in his head that we needed to camp somewhere the map went blank. No trails, no signal, no people. Just what he called pure wilderness. I told him it was a stupid idea. But Mason had a way of making common sense feel like cowardice. And I was 26 years old, still trying to prove I wasn't scared. So I went. We took his truck, bouncing over a road that was more pothole than pavement. It ended at a rusted gate. The chain was gone. The hinges screamed when Mason kicked it open. He laughed. We parked in a gravel patch long since reclaimed by weeds. When I stepped out, the air felt wrong. It smelled of rust and rot, and something else underneath, a sharp metallic tang like old pennies and blood. The first few miles were easy. An old service road, its ruts filled with murky rainwater. It was early fall, and the woods were still thick with green, but they were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be holding back. Mason glanced back at me, a grin on his face. "Feels like we're the last two people on Earth," he said. He meant it to sound profound. It just made my skin crawl. But we weren't the first. Every mile or so, we'd pass a ghost. A stone chimney standing alone, its house rotted away to nothing. A pile of blue glass bottles half buried in the mud. A cast iron stove sinking into a thicket of thorns. These were not places people left. They were places people fled. That night, we camped by a creek. Mason, proud of his new survival gear, made a fire with a spark wheel. He boasted about not needing matches if you were a real outdoorsman. I just cooked my noodles and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. It was a physical sensation, a pressure on the back of my neck. Mason snored. I lay awake watching the fire die. The trees looked like they were inching closer every time I blinked. I heard footsteps in the dry leaves, slow, soft, deliberate. The steps of something trying not to sound like steps. I'd hold my breath. The sound would stop. It happened over and over until I wasn't sure if I was hearing it at all. Morning came, gray and damp. We packed up in silence. The trail dissolved into a deer path. We had to climb over fallen trees and feel our way through the undergrowth. Around noon, Mason stopped. He pointed up at an old poplar tree. Nailed to the trunk was a splintered board. The paint was almost gone, but 3 words were still visible. "No return trail." Mason laughed. He called it a prank. I didn't say anything. I was thinking about the kind of person who would hike this far into nowhere, just to leave a warning. And I was thinking about what they were warning against. Later, we stopped to eat on a rocky bluff. The ground dropped away into a steep gully. As I unwrapped a protein bar, I saw movement below, a flash of pale color between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was tall, moving with an unnatural grace. Then it stepped into a sliver of sunlight and it stood up. My mind refused to process it. Its arms were too long, hanging nearly to its knees. Its skin was the color of bleached bone. It turned its head, a slow, scanning motion. And as it tilted its face to the sky, I saw its jaw unhinge. It split down the center, falling open in a way that defied bone and muscle. I didn't see a monster. I saw an impossibility. My hands clenched, crushing the protein bar. A wave of nausea washed over me. The thing stepped behind a wall of trees and was gone. "You okay?" Mason asked. He'd finally noticed the look on my face. I couldn't speak. My throat was glued shut. I just nodded. I didn't tell him. The knowledge was a cold stone in my gut, and it made me feel utterly alone. That night, the woods began to speak. We camped in a small hollow. Convinced Mason not to build a fire. I didn't want anything to see our light. I lay in my tent, the darkness pressing in. Then the silence started. First, the crickets stopped. Then the owls. The entire forest held its breath, and a voice drifted out of the trees. It was a low mumble at first. Then it grew clearer. My blood ran cold. It was my mother's voice. The same soft, gentle tone she used when I was a child, scared of the dark. Cowan, it called my name. My chest went hollow. My logical brain fought it. A trick of the wind. An auditory hallucination. But it was her, I knew it. I turned to shake Mason awake. My hand hit cold, empty nylon. His sleeping bag was empty. I scrambled out of my tent. The flashlight beam shook in my hand. "Mason," I yelled. The trees drank the sound. Then I heard her again. Farther away this time. "Cowan, honey. Come here." A sick, primal part of me wanted to run toward the sound. The part that still missed my mother. But a deeper, colder instinct held me in place. I swept the flashlight in a slow arc, and the beam found it. It stood 20 yards away, half hidden by an oak. The pale skin looked slick, stretched too tight over bones that were the wrong shape. Those long arms hung limp at its sides, the fingers brushing the dead leaves. I couldn't see any eyes. Just a smooth, pale canvas of skin where a face should be. It shifted, sliding from behind the tree. It moved like a marionette with its strings cut. Its shoulders twisting at an impossible angle. It began to circle me. Slow, patient, it knew I was trapped. I stumbled backward. My foot hit a rock. The flashlight beam jumped, and for a fraction of a second, it illuminated another shape. Another flicker of pale skin between the trees. There were two of them. That's when I broke. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at my skin, branches whipping my face. My heart felt like it was trying to tear its way out of my chest. Behind me, the voices rose. First my mother's, then Mason's, loud and clear. "Cowan, wait up!" Then another voice joined in. I own all of them calling my name. A chorus of stolen sounds. I was running from my mother, from my cousin. I was running from myself. I don't know how long I ran. The world was a black, chaotic blur. My only thought was, don't stop. When my feet finally hit the packed dirt of the old service road, the sky was a bruised purple. My legs gave out. I collapsed, my lungs burning. Later, a Forest Service truck found me. The ranger's face was grim. He gave me water. He asked where Mason was. I tried to answer, but no words came out. I just shook my head over and over. I never told him what I saw. He wouldn't have believed me. Or maybe he would have. And that thought was even more terrifying. They searched for him for a week. They found his pack and his empty tent, but they never found a single track leading away from the campsite. It was just like Granddad said. The ridges had swallowed him whole. The sound of wind intensifies for a moment, then fades back to a low, ominous drone. Of course, here is the third story, rewritten as requested. It was just a whistle. 2 notes clean and clear, drifting down from the ridge. A simple sound, the kind a man might make to call his dog. But out there, in the dead quiet of Jasper Bend, it wasn't a call. It was a question. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was waiting for an answer. I grew up in a forgotten corner of southern Missouri. It's the kind of place people leave, not the kind they come back to. I'd spent my 20s in St. Louis, convincing myself I was done with dirt roads and the suffocating silence of the Ozarks. But you can't outrun where you're from. Sometimes it calls you back. My Uncle Randall passed in October. The funeral was small. Afterward, I stood in the church parking lot, my hands shoved in my pockets, feeling a hollow space under my ribs. It wasn't just grief. It was something older, a low-grade dread I'd carried since I was a kid. A feeling that some things once seen never really leave you. I didn't go back to my mom's. Instead, I drove to the gas station, filled a thermos with burnt coffee, and headed for Jasper Bend. It wasn't a park. It wasn't a preserve. It was just a place on a map. The old stories claimed a logging crew had vanished there in the 1800s. Some said a rock slide. Others whispered it was something else. Something that lived in the hollows and didn't like to be disturbed. All I knew was that no one went there. And being alone was exactly what I wanted. Or so I thought. The trail began at a rusted gate hanging crooked on one hinge. A wooden sign was so weathered the letters were just ghosts in the grain. I almost turned around. The quiet out there was heavy. It had a weight to it. But I killed the engine, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was a lie. It was just a memory of a path, choked with thorns and fallen limbs. The ground would suddenly drop into deep gullies carved by a century of rain. I slipped once, my hand landing on a root that felt soft and yielding, like flesh. I looked up at the ridge, a dark spine against the bruised twilight sky. It was so easy to imagine just disappearing out here. A wrong step, a silent fall. Gone. About a mile in, I found what was left of an old fence. The posts were rotted to stubs. Just beyond it was a small clearing. In the center, a circle of stones marked the ghost of a foundation, and growing from a shallow pit in the middle of it was a single twisted sapling. I don't know why, but the sight of it made my mouth go dry. I gave it a wide berth. I didn't want to get any closer. The light was failing when the path dipped toward the river. It was low, just a trickle of black water between wet stones. I found a flat patch of ground beneath a low bluff. My boots left dark, sharp prints in the silt. As I bent to set down my pack, I saw them. Other footprints. They were faint, half erased, but they were there. And they were wrong. They were too narrow, too long, and the stride was impossibly wide. as if whatever made them was taking huge, loping steps. Or maybe it was jumping from spot to spot. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I told myself they were old, weeks old. I forced myself to build a small fire. I sat close, the heat a small comfort against the growing dark. That's when I heard it. The whistle, a low, two-note call drifting down the slope. It was perfect. Too perfect, deliberate. I held my breath. A few seconds passed. It came again. Same notes. Same careful pause. It was listening. My throat felt like it was lined with chalk. "Hello?" I called out. My voice was a thin, pathetic thing. It didn't belong here. There was no answer. The silence that followed was worse than the whistle. It felt heavy. It felt occupied. I let the fire burn down to embers and crawled into my tent. I didn't zip it shut. I lay on my back, my old hunting knife resting on my chest. Every nerve in my body was screaming. I must have drifted off because I woke up hours later to my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I listened. And I heard it. The slow crunch of a single leaf. A careful, deliberate step. Then another. It was close. Maybe 10 feet from my tent. It moved along the edge of the bluff. Its steps unnervingly quiet. Then it stopped, right outside my tent. The air grew thick, pressing down on me. And then something touched the tent wall, just a single finger. It traced the nylon fabric, right above my knee. I could feel the pressure through the thin material. My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth would crack. The finger moved again, slower this time. It was feeling the shape of my leg through the sleeping bag. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I was no longer a person. I was just a thing, holding its breath in the dark. After an eternity, the pressure lifted. I heard the steps again, careful, deliberate, moving away. The sound faded into the trees. I didn't move until the sky began to turn gray. When I finally crawled out of the tent, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my knife. The ground was undisturbed. No tracks, no broken twigs. Nothing to prove it had been there. But I knew. I tore down my camp in a panic. I didn't stop to eat. I just walked, head down, the pack strap digging into my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, the relief was so intense my knees almost buckled. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped dead. Something was propped against the driver's side door. It was a piece of pale, curled bark. Someone had carved a figure into it, a stick figure with long, thin legs and an oval head. But it had no arms. Just that stark, empty silhouette leaning against my door, waiting for me. It began with a knock. 3 short, calm raps on the front door. Not hurried, not frantic. The knock of someone who knows your home. The knock of someone who is patient. It was midnight, deep in the Allegheny foothills, and I was the only living soul for miles. My life had fallen apart. My girlfriend left. My job cut my hours. My mother kept calling, her voice thick with a pity I couldn't stand. I needed to escape. So I ran to the one place no one would follow me, my uncle's old house in Nolan's Hollow. It wasn't a house so much as a collection of wood and secrets leaning against a hillside. The foundation was crumbling stone. The silence was absolute. I'd only ever visited for holidays as a kid, and even then, I hated being there after dark. But now it was my only refuge. I told myself it was temporary, a place to get my head straight. I wasn't wrong about the quiet. The days were long and silent. I split wood, patched drafts, and tried not to think. But at night, the house came alive. The old beams would groan and pop. It sounded like someone pacing in the room above me. I told myself it was just the house settling. I kept the generator fueled. I kept the doors locked. And I kept a revolver in a small lockbox by my bed. Not because I was scared. Out here, you were just supposed to be prepared. That's what I told myself. That night was like any other. I ate instant noodles that tasted like paste and read a book I'd already finished twice. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the first sound. Soft scrape on the porch, like a dry branch being dragged across the wood. I didn't even look up at first. It was probably a raccoon. But then it came again. A papery, rustling sound, and it ended with 3 small, distinct taps against the door. I set my book down. I walked to the window and looked out. The porch was empty. The old rocking chair was perfectly still. I cracked the door open. A blast of cold, sour air hit me. It smelled like rot. I leaned out. Nothing. No footprints in the thin layer of frost on the ground. I shut the door and slid the deadbolt home. My shoulders were tight. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. The room slowly took shape in the gloom. The couch, the stack of firewood, the tiny green light of the generator in the kitchen. I kept telling myself it was nothing. An old house makes noises. An hour later, right before midnight, came the knock. 3 sharp, confident raps on the door. I stood up so fast my book clattered to the floor. I didn't call out. I walked to the door and pressed my palm against the wood. It was cold, almost damp. I leaned into the peephole. The porch was empty. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I backed away from the door. I went to my chair, but this time I took the revolver from its box and laid it across my lap. It felt heavy and real in the quiet room. I sat there, listening. An hour passed, then another. The adrenaline began to fade. My body ached from holding still. I started to believe it was over. Whatever it was had given up. I stood up, my legs stiff. I decided I'd check the upstairs windows, then try to sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, upstairs. Not a creak, not a groan. The slow, steady tread of someone walking from the far end of the hall toward the top of the stairs. I froze, my hand clutching the revolver. I waited for it to stop. It didn't. The footsteps crossed back, heavier this time, heading for the spare room. I reached for the lamp. The light felt harsh and weak. My hand went to the lockbox, a nervous habit. It was already open. I'd forgotten to close it. I checked the cylinder, loaded. I walked to the base of the stairs. Anyone up there? My voice was thin. There was no reply. I took the first step. It groaned. The footsteps above started again, pacing, back and forth, deliberate. They wanted me to hear them. I climbed to the landing. My uncle's old bedroom door was cracked open. I raised the gun. I flicked the light switch on the wall. Nothing. The bulb was dead. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. A bare mattress on a metal frame. An empty dresser. The window was locked from the inside. I backed out slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. I closed the door and turned, and I heard a whisper. It came from the other side of my bedroom door. A thin, dry voice. It was repeating a string of words I didn't recognize, a language made of rustles and clicks. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the cold wood. My own pulse throbbed against the door. I took a shallow breath and threw the door open. Silence. The room was exactly as I'd left it. My unmade bed, my bag against the closet. Then from the corner of my eye I saw it. A shape. A flicker of movement along the wall. It was tall and unnaturally thin. It was wrapped in something dark and ragged, like burial shrouds. It didn't have a face. It was just a column of shadow and cloth. I jerked the revolver up, my finger on the trigger. But before I could fire, it was gone. It didn't run. It slid out the door, moving with a speed that wasn't real. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. Down the stairs, out the front door, across the yard. I didn't stop until I hit the dirt road. I bent over, gasping for air, my throat raw. My chest felt like it was going to split open. I looked back at the house. It stood dark and silent against the trees. I waited there until the sun came up. I never set foot inside that house again. The pacing footsteps, the dry whisper, the shape in the corner, they're all still in there, waiting. "Run," that was all he said. The word wasn't a shout, it wasn't a warning. It was a flat, dead command. It came from a man who had appeared out of the suffocating silence of the Tennessee woods, a man whose face was a mask of dirt and shadow. His breath smelled like freshly turned earth, and his hand, when it had clamped down on my shoulder, felt as cold and heavy as a stone. And behind him, from the black maw of a collapsed cellar, came a sound. A low, wet, scraping breath, the sound of something stirring in its sleep. I didn't need to be told twice. It all started because my grandfather died. He'd lived his entire life in a small house tucked into a fold of the eastern Tennessee mountains. After he was gone, the duty of cleaning it out fell to me. I hadn't been back in years. Driving up the overgrown lane, I saw that the hollow had already begun to reclaim what was its. Kudzu, the vine that eats the south, was consuming everything. It draped the roof, choked the porch swing, and climbed the walls like a slow-motion green flood. The house looked like it was being dragged back into the hillside. Inside, the air was a physical presence. It was a cocktail of mildew, dust, and the sour ghost of my grandfather's pipe smoke. I spent the day sorting through a life that had been packed away in boxes and drawers. Water-damaged books, stacks of old magazines with faded covers, moth-eaten quilts that crumbled in my hands. The silence was the worst part. It was a hollow, empty space where his gruff voice and heavy footsteps should have been. With each box I packed, the house felt less like a home and more like a tomb. By late afternoon, I was aching, covered in a film of grime and sadness. I was standing in the kitchen staring at nothing when I saw them. A set of keys hanging on a rusty nail by the doorframe. The plastic fob was faded, the word Polaris barely legible. They were the keys to my grandfather's old ATV. A flood of memories hit me. Me as a teenager tearing down the dirt trails, feeling wild and free. My grandfather, leaning on the porch railing, a small, rare smile on his face, pretending not to watch me. He never said much, but I knew he liked seeing me out there, learning the shape of his land. In that moment, surrounded by the decay and the quiet, all I wanted was to feel that again. To escape the oppressive weight of the house and reconnect with the boy I used to be. It was a foolish, sentimental impulse, and it was a mistake. I grabbed the keys. The engine coughed to life with a plume of blue smoke. I steered it onto the old trail behind the barn, the same rutted path I'd known my whole life. The first mile was familiar, the path winding between drooping fence posts and skeletal trees. But the farther I went, the more the woods changed. They grew thicker, darker. The trees leaned in, their branches weaving a canopy that starved the forest floor of light. I passed an old hunting blind, nailed high in the branches of a walnut tree. I remembered it from my childhood, a secret fort in the sky. Now it was a wreck. The plywood walls were peeling away. The ladder leading up to it was snapped in half. I slowed the ATV idling. The break in the wood wasn't the soft, splintered decay of rot. It was a sharp, violent fracture, as if something huge and impossibly strong had simply put its weight on the rung and snapped it clean in two. A cold prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. For a moment, I thought about turning back, but I pushed the feeling down. It was just old wood, I told myself. Just the woods taking back what was theirs. I kept going. Another 15 minutes of bouncing over roots and rocks, and the trail opened into a clearing I didn't recognize. It was a shallow bowl in the earth, ringed by a tight circle of black locust trees. And in that bowl sat 3 trailers. They were rusted skeletons, their aluminum siding pitted and torn, their windows smashed out like vacant eyes. They looked like they had been dragged out here decades ago and left to die. It was a grim, forgotten place. The kind of place where bad things happen and are never spoken of again. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute. No birds, no insects, a dead, listening stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. That's when I saw the tire tracks. They were fresh. The tread marks were sharp and clear in the damp earth, cutting a path directly between the trailers. Someone had been here recently. My unease solidified into a knot of genuine fear. Who would come out here and why? I swung my leg off the ATV. My boots made no sound in the soft dirt. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through something thicker than air. I approached the nearest trailer. The door was gone, leaving a dark, gaping hole. I braced my hand on the frame, my legs feeling unsteady. Inside, the floor was a mess of dead leaves and scraps of what looked like stained, molded carpet. In the far corner, something caught my eye. It was a pile of bones. Small animal bones, raccoons, squirrels, maybe a fox. They had been picked clean and stacked in neat, careful rows. Arranged by size, like a grotesque display in a natural history museum. This wasn't an animal's lair. This was the work of a person who was methodical, patient, and deeply disturbed. I started to back away, and that's when I saw the twine. It was strung across the doorway, almost invisible in the gloom. Dangling from it like beads on a necklace were small, gray, round objects. They clacked together softly in a breeze I couldn't feel. At first, I thought they were stones or carved pieces of wood. I leaned closer. They were skulls. Bird skulls, maybe? Each one had been drilled through the top and threaded onto the string. My throat closed up. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I should have run. I should have gotten on that ATV and driven until I hit pavement. But I couldn't. A dark, stubborn curiosity had its hooks in me. I had to know where those fresh tracks led. I had to see the end of this. It felt like I had stepped into a story, and I couldn't leave until I'd read the final, terrible page. I followed the tracks. They led past the trailers and onto a narrow path that snaked down into the deep woods. The trees here were different, ancient and dark. Nailed to their trunks were crude wooden plaques, painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals that coiled into stick figures with no arms, circles with jagged lines slashed through them. The paint was a dark, flaky brown, the color of dried blood. I tried not to think about what it was made of. I don't know how long I walked. The sun was disappearing fast, the light growing thin and weak. The trail finally leveled out in a hollow so deep it was already in twilight. There, sunk into the hillside, was the collapsed stone foundation of an old building. A black square doorway was set into the wall. It looked like a wound in the earth. The smell hit me when I was still 20 feet away. A thick, cloying sweetness. Smell of rot, but not plant rot. It was the smell of meat that had gone bad, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of a freshly dug grave. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. I clicked on my phone's flashlight, the beam seeming pathetically weak in the oppressive darkness. I pointed it into the doorway. In the far corner of the stone enclosure was a pile of what looked like old burlap sacks. As the light hit them, they moved. Not a sudden movement, a slow undulating ripple, like something large and soft was shifting its weight beneath them. And then I heard it, a scraping breath. Low, wet, and ragged, my knees went weak. I thought I was going to fall. I took one stumbling step backward, my mind screaming at me to run. Before I could take a second step, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze. Every thought in my head evaporated. I turned, my body rigid with terror. A man stood beside me. He wore a battered canvas hat pulled low, his face a landscape of wrinkles and dirt. His eyes were lost in shadow. His mouth was twisted into a strange, polite, utterly mirrorless smile. "Don't go in there," he said. His voice was a low rumble, calm as a summer evening. I just stared, unable to move or speak. He raised a single, dirt-caked finger to his lips, a gesture for silence. "You don't belong here," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Turn around. Go back the way you came. I was paralyzed. I was a statue of fear." He leaned closer. His breath smelled like rich soil and decay. His shadowed eyes seemed to bore right through me. His voice was a harsh whisper now. "Run." He let go of me. The spell was broken. I spun and bolted up the trail. I didn't run, I fled. My lungs burned. My legs were numb. I didn't dare look back. I knew with a certainty that defied all logic, that if I looked back, I would see something that would shatter my mind. I scrambled back into the clearing. The trailers loomed in the dusk like sleeping beasts. I fumbled for the ATV keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I wrenched the handlebars and fishtailed in the dirt, then shot up the trail, not caring about the rocks or the ruts. I didn't slow down until the roof of my grandfather's house appeared through the trees. I parked the ATV and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the handlebars, my whole body trembling. When the sun finally rose, I packed my truck. I took the box of my grandfather's things, but I left the ATV keys on the porch. Under a loose brick, I was giving them back. It wasn't my land anymore. It belonged to the hollow, and to whatever was sleeping in it. "Alone, there's someone outside." Her voice came through the thick cellar door, muffled and thin with terror. I was trapped in the dark, my hand shaking so badly the flashlight beam danced across the damp dirt floor. The air was cold and smelled of rot and wet fur. And behind me, in the deepest shadows of the cellar, something was beginning to uncurl itself. It had my cousin Paige's voice on the phone that had brought me here. Her grandfather had passed away, died alone in his cabin, so deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains that the mailman had been the one to find him. The mail had piled up on the porch for over a week before anyone thought to check. Paige couldn't face going in there by herself. Her voice was brittle with a fear she was trying to hide. I told her I'd help. I had no idea what I was agreeing to. The driveway was a ghost of a logging road, a pair of dirt ruts fighting a losing battle against the wilderness. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping the roof of my truck. It felt like we were driving into a tunnel with no end. When we finally broke into the clearing, the cabin was waiting. It was a miserable, hunched-over thing, leaning so hard to one side it looked like a strong wind would push it over. The roof was a patchwork of moss and missing shingles. It wasn't a home. It was a scar on the landscape. We sat in the truck for a long minute, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was absolute. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the clearing was dim, trapped in the permanent shade of the surrounding ridges. "You brought a flashlight, right?" Paige asked, her gaze fixed on the cabin's dark windows. "Yeah," I said, my own voice tight. I could feel a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. The porch steps groaned under our weight. The front door wasn't locked. It drifted open with a soft sigh, as if it had been waiting for us. The smell hit me like a physical blow. It was a thick, heavy stench of stale grease, mildew, and something else, something vaguely metallic and sour. It was the smell of a place where something had died and been left to rot. The inside was a disaster. A sagging recliner sat in one corner, its stuffing spilling out. A folding table was buried under a mountain of yellowed newspapers and empty cans. Dust lay over everything like a fine gray snow. Paige pulled her shirt up over her nose. "God," she whispered. "It's worse than I imagined." "Let's just get it done," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We worked in near silence. Paige tackled the living room, filling trash bags with years of accumulated junk. I went to the kitchen. The linoleum was cracked and peeling. And there, on the floor by the stove, was a dark, ugly stain that had soaked deep into the wood. I looked away, my stomach churning. I opened the cabinets. Most were filled with ancient soft-sided boxes of cereal and glass jars of what might have once been fruit preserves. I didn't touch them. I just closed the doors. The hallway led to a single bedroom. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were crowded with more jars. Hundreds of them. Some had handwritten labels, okra, beans, peaches. But the contents had long since devolved into a gray, unrecognizable sludge. My eyes scanned the rows of glass. One jar, tucked in the back, caught my attention. It held a single, pale, lumpy object suspended in a cloudy liquid. It was curled in on itself like a fetus. For a horrifying second, I thought I saw it move. Just a faint, rhythmic pulse. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart pounding. I spent the next hour hauling trash bags and armloads of musty blankets out to the truck. With each trip, the air inside the cabin seemed to get thicker, heavier. I could feel it pressing on my chest. Paige was quiet, but every few minutes, I'd see her glance down the hall at the closed bedroom door. Her expression a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. As the afternoon light began to fade, a new urgency set in. "We need to check the cellar before it gets dark," I told her. She froze. Her hand was buried in a box of old photographs. "He never let me down there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "When I was a kid, he told me it wasn't safe." "Not safe how?" I asked. She just shrugged, her shoulders bunching up around her ears. "He just said to stay out." He kept it locked. I didn't push it. I found the cellar door at the back of the kitchen. It was a simple plank door with a heavy iron latch. The hinges shrieked in protest as I pulled it open. A wave of cold, damp air rolled up the stairs, carrying that smell of wet fur and decay. It was stronger now. I took a deep breath of the stale kitchen air and started down. The stairs were steep and crude. My flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the darkness. The cellar floor was just packed earth. In the center of the room was a large, heavy wooden table. Its surface was a mess of deep gouges and dark stains. Above it, a row of iron hooks dangled from a ceiling beam, swaying gently in a draft I couldn't feel. They looked like meat hooks. On the far wall, more shelves, more jars. But these were different. The liquid inside was a sickly yellow, and the things floating in them, they weren't fruits or vegetables. They were twisted, pale shapes that didn't resemble any animal I recognized. I was moving closer, an awful fascination pulling me in, when I heard the footsteps on the floor directly above me. Slow, heavy, deliberate. "Paige?" I called out. My voice echoed in the small, damp space. There was no answer. A cold dread washed over me. I turned and scrambled back up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I reached the top just as the door swung shut in my face. The heavy latch clicked into place. The sound was a hammer blow to my chest. "Hey! Paige!" I slammed my palm against the door. "Open the door." Her voice came back, small and trembling. "Alone, there's someone outside." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, someone?" "He's standing by the trees," she whimpered. "Just watching the house," my mind raced. "Paige, listen to me. Just open the door. We'll get in the truck and leave. Right now." "He's watching me," she repeated, her voice distant. Then I heard her footsteps moving away from the door. "Paige! Paige!" Silence. I was alone, trapped in the dark. I swallowed hard, trying to control the shaking in my hands. I swept the flashlight beam across the cellar again. The beam wobbled over the dirt floor, the stained table, the rows of grotesque jars. And then behind me something shifted, a soft rustling sound. I turned. In the corner, behind a stack of old burlap sacks, a shape was unfolding itself. It rose from the shadows, a thing of impossible angles. Its limbs were too long, too thin. One arm stretched out, the elbow bending the wrong way with a soft, wet pop. I backed up until my spine hit the cellar stairs. My breath was coming in ragged, useless gasps. The thing raised its head. My flashlight beam found its face. There was no face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin stretched tight over a skull. There were no eyes. There was no mouth. There was just a blank white canvas of absolute horror. It began to crawl toward me. It didn't have legs. It dragged its long, emaciated torso across the dirt floor, its two long arms pulling it forward, inch by agonizing inch. Each movement made a soft, wet, sucking sound. I threw my shoulder against the door. The wood groaned. I hit it again, all my weight, all my terror behind the blow. A crack appeared near the latch. I hit it a third time. The lock splintered. The door flew open, and I tumbled out into the kitchen. Paige was standing by the table, her back to me. She was staring out the window, her body rigid. "Where is he?" I gasped, scrambling to my feet. She turned slowly. Her eyes were wide and blank. "He walked back into the trees," she said, her voice flat and empty. I didn't wait for another word. I grabbed her wrist and pulled. I dragged her out of that cursed house, across the groaning porch, and toward the truck. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I shoved her into the passenger seat and jumped in behind the wheel. As the headlights cut through the gloom, I saw it. For just a second, a shape slipped between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, and it moved in a gliding, unnatural way that my brain couldn't process. Paige let out a single, strangled sob. I stomped on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. We didn't speak. We didn't breathe. We just drove, leaving that hollow and its terrible secrets behind us in the dark. It said my name, a single word, spoken in a low, close whisper right outside my tent. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement, the voice of something that had been waiting for me, something that knew exactly who I was and where to find me. And in the absolute crushing silence of that unmarked hollow in the Blue Valley Range, hearing my own name was the most terrifying sound I could possibly imagine. I was 32, and I had something to prove. Mostly to myself. I'd been a weekend camper for years, but I was haunted by the desire for true solitude. I wanted to go somewhere completely off the grid, a place with no trails, no signs, and no possibility of seeing another human face. I wanted to know if I could handle being truly, utterly alone. I spent a month planning the trip, poring over old topographic maps, looking for the blank spaces. I found my spot in a forgotten corner of the range, a place accessible only by a network of decaying forestry roads. I even dug out a faded pamphlet from a ranger station, titled Unrecorded Hollows of the Blue Valley. The pages were warped and smelled of mildew, but they hinted at a wilderness untouched for generations. It was exactly what I was looking for. I prepared meticulously. I bought a new tent, a new first aid kit, A hand-crank radio for a worst-case scenario I refused to picture. I packed 3 different knives. It seemed like the right amount of caution at the time. The day before I left, I called my brother Matt. I tried to sound casual. Going off-grid for a week, I told him. "Don't send out a search party if you don't hear from me." He sighed. "You're just asking to be the subject of a true crime podcast, you know that?" I laughed it off. But a small, cold part of me wondered if he was right. The drive in was an exercise in patience. Paved roads gave way to gravel, and gravel gave way to a dirt track that was little more than a suggestion. I finally parked where the road surrendered completely to the wilderness. There was no trailhead marker, no welcoming sign, just a narrow gap in the trees that looked like it had been made by deer, not men. For a moment I considered turning back. The silence was already unnerving, but I'd come too far. I shouldered my heavy pack and stepped into the green abyss. The first day was perfect. The silence I'd feared became a comfort. It was a clean, profound quiet that scrubbed the city from my mind. I hiked for hours, navigating by compass in the lay of the land. The only signs of a human past were the ghosts it had left behind. A crumbling stone chimney standing sentinel in a sun-dappled clearing. A line of rusted fence posts swallowed by vines. The woods were reclaiming everything. Late in the afternoon, I found my campsite. It was a flat patch of ground on a ridge overlooking a deep hollow. A small stream gurgled over pale stones at the bottom. I pitched my tent in a natural depression between 3 massive boulders. The spot felt sheltered, hidden. I spent an hour building a fire ring, then sat and watched the flames dance as the sky turned from blue to indigo. The quiet was deeper here. It was a living thing. I ate a pouch of freeze-dried stew that tasted like salty cardboard and scribbled a few notes in my journal. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent. I laid my hand on the cool handle of the knife on my belt. It was a habit on solo trips, a small solid piece of reassurance against the vast unknown dark. I woke the next morning to a world swathed in mist. It curled along the ground, making the familiar woods look alien and strange. After a breakfast of instant coffee, I decided to explore the gully that dropped away from my ridge. The deeper I went, the more certain I became that no one had been there in a very long time. Fallen trees blocked the way like barricades. The air was still and damp. I found a length of rusted chain half buried in the leaf litter, and a little farther on, a small pile of animal bones picked clean. They were small, a raccoon maybe, but seeing them laid out on the moss gave me a prickle of unease. On the way back to my camp, I saw it. To the side of the faint animal trail I was following, there was a patch of freshly turned earth. It was a rough, uneven mound, not a neat burrow. The hole beside it was too wide and shallow for any animal I knew. It looked hasty, messy. It looked like someone had dug it with their bare hands. A cold, crawling sensation moved up the back of my neck. I didn't get any closer. I just backed away slowly and returned to my camp. The image of that disturbed earth burned into my mind. That evening, I couldn't relax. I built the fire up, feeding it stick after stick, trying to push back the encroaching shadows. I sat with my back against one of the large boulders, telling myself I just needed to stay awake, to stay vigilant. It was a futile effort. At some point, my exhaustion won. I nodded off. I woke to a dying fire and a deep, penetrating cold. The moon was high and bright, casting sharp black shadows. For a moment, I was disoriented. Then I heard it. A voice. "Adam." It was a whisper, but it was as clear as if the speaker were standing right beside me. My name, spoken with a quiet, calm certainty. My blood turned to ice. My throat closed. My ears were ringing. I was completely, utterly frozen. I waited for it to speak again. It didn't. There was only the ringing silence. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Hypnagogic hallucination, a trick of a tired mind. But I didn't sleep again. I sat there, wide-eyed and terrified, until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. I unzipped the tent with trembling hands. I expected to see footprints, some sign that I wasn't alone. There was nothing. The clearing was exactly as I had left it. The pristine, undisturbed wilderness was suddenly the most terrifying thing I could imagine. It meant that whatever had spoken my name had left no trace. I spent the day in a state of high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. As dusk began to settle again, a slow, crushing pressure built in my chest. I knew I couldn't stay another night. But the thought of hiking out in the dark was just as terrifying. That night, I built a bonfire. I dragged every piece of dry wood I could find into a massive pile and set it ablaze. The flames roared, casting a huge, flickering circle of light that kept the deepest dark at bay. I sat with my back pressed against the largest boulder, my knees pulled up to my chest, the knife in my hand. I was determined to stay awake. I don't know when I drifted off. I woke with a start. The fire was a bed of glowing red embers. The cold was seeping into my bones. And then I heard it, breathing. It was coming from directly behind the boulder I was leaning against. It was slow, deep, deliberate. A calm, rhythmic sound that was utterly out of place. It was the sound of something large resting. It didn't care that I could hear it. It was so close I felt like I could feel the vibration of it through the stone. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped my flashlight. I was paralyzed. I stared at the dying fire, my mind screaming at me to look over my shoulder, while every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me not to. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried. Never changed pace, just went on and on. A horrific living metronome in the dark. It continued until the first weak light of morning began to creep through the trees. And then it just stopped. The silence it left behind was a physical thing. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by hours of pure terror. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady. I broke camp in a frenzy, stuffing gear into my pack without care. Just had to get out. I hiked hard and fast, not daring to look back. My breath came in ragged sobs. The trail that had seemed so open and welcoming 2 days ago now felt claustrophobic, the trees leaning in to trap me. About a mile from where I'd parked my car, I stopped dead. In the middle of the trail, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a single boot print. It was huge, at least 2 sizes larger than mine. The heel was dug in deep, but there were no other prints, none leading to it, none leading away. It was just there, a single impossible footprint placed deliberately in my path. Sign, a message. I didn't study it. I didn't take a picture. I just ran. I burst out of the trees and saw my car, a beautiful, mundane symbol of civilization. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and fumbled with the keys, my hands refusing to obey. When the engine finally turned over, I didn't look back. I drove for 10 miles without slowing down, until the dense forest gave way to open pasture land, and the suffocating silence of the hollow was replaced by the reassuring hum of the tires on pavement. That was the last time I ever went looking for solitude. I had found it, and something else had found me. It raised one arm, a slow, deliberate motion, and it pointed, not at me, but back into the suffocating darkness of the woods I had just fled. It was a silent, unmistakable command. Go back. I stood by my truck, the key trembling in my hand, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I couldn't see a face. The thing standing at the edge of the tree line was just a tall, stained shape, a pillar of darkness against the gloom. But I understood the gesture perfectly. I had stumbled into a place I was never meant to be, and it didn't want to let me go. That summer, I was working for a small conservation group in the southern Blue Ridge. My job was to survey remote land parcels, cataloging flora and fauna. It sounds idyllic. Mostly it was just sweating through my shirt while trying to identify different types of moss. We were a small crew and we took turns on the assignments. The old-timers called the most remote parcels forgotten tracks, which sounded overly dramatic to me. I was wrong. Forgotten wasn't a strong enough word. The first Monday in June, my supervisor, Elena, handed me a file. "Good luck," she said without looking up. "This one's a black hole." The file was for track 14. The last field report was dated 1978. It was a blurry, typewritten document, mostly just a list of trees. But at the very bottom, a single cryptic line had been added. "Old dwelling remains. Advise caution." That was it. No details, no explanation. Just a vague, unsettling warning left by a man named Brooks 40 years ago. I figured he'd probably been spooked by a black bear. I wished it had been a bear. The drive out was a descent into isolation. The main road turned to gravel. The gravel thinned to dirt, and the dirt eventually dissolved into a pair of weed-choked ruts. My truck scraped and bumped its way into a part of the world that had been left behind. When the road gave up completely, I pulled over. The silence that rushed in was immediate and profound. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. After a few minutes of searching, I found the only marker, a warped wooden board nailed to a sycamore tree with the number 14 burned into it. It looked less like a sign and more like a warning. I shouldered my pack, clipped my compass to the strap, and stepped over the skeletal remains of a collapsed fence. The woods swallowed me in less than 20 steps. The trees were giants, their trunks scarred and ancient. The canopy was so thick that the forest floor was in a perpetual state of twilight. For the first hour, it was just a hard, steady climb. I made my notes, cataloging plants, feeling like an intruder in a place that had long forgotten the presence of man. My GPS was useless, its signal blinking in and out. I relied on my compass and the contours of the land. I was working my way along a ridge when I saw it. A subtle break in the undergrowth, a dip in the slope that didn't look natural. My job was to stick to the survey route, but something pulled me off course. A feeling, a strange, insistent curiosity that felt less like my own and more like an invitation. I climbed down into the hollow. There it was, the ghost of a house, a rectangular foundation of stacked stones, half crumbled and reclaimed by moss. Inside the perimeter, a rusted iron stove lay on its side, its stovepipe bent into a brutal right angle, as if it had been wrenched by an impossible force. I stepped over the low stone wall, my boots crunching on dead leaves. I started kicking them aside. I found shards of thick, wavy glass from an old window. A spoon, its bowl hammered almost flat, and then a child's lunchbox. It was rusted, the paint faded, but I could just make out a cartoon bear family, smiling under a cheerful sun. The image was so innocent, so out of place in this decaying ruin, that it made my skin crawl. I crouched down. The latch was stiff, but it gave way with a screech of rusted metal. Inside was a wadded-up piece of blue cloth and a handful of marbles. The marbles were pristine, swirls of bright red, yellow, and blue, gleaming as if they were made yesterday. They looked wrong. They looked too new. I was turning one over in my palm, its surface cool and smooth, when I heard it. A sound from the trees above me on the ridge. A slow, heavy shift of weight. The sound of something large moving from one foot to the other. I froze. My first thought was bear. My second thought was no bear moves that quietly. I stood up, my heart starting a nervous, fluttery rhythm in my chest. I scanned the trees but saw only trunks and shadows. Just an animal, I whispered to myself, but the words felt hollow and unconvincing. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I stepped back over the stone wall and started to move around the edge of the ruin, looking for tracks. That's when I heard the second sound, higher up the slope, the sharp crack of a dry branch breaking, followed by a soft thud. I tried to sound casual. "Hey, just a conservation survey down here." My voice came out thin and reedy. Silence. The woods offered no reply. I took a few cautious steps up the hill. I saw a massive tulip poplar, its bark pale as bone. I leaned to look behind it, my breath held tight in my chest. There was nothing there. No animal, no person. But the ground was marked. A single clear boot print was pressed deep into the leaf litter. The heel was dug in, as if its owner had pushed off in a hurry. A jolt of pure instinctual fear went through me. Something inside me snapped. The scientific curiosity, the sense of adventure, it all vanished, replaced by a single primal command. Get out. I turned and scrambled back down the slope. My breathing was thin and ragged. My GPS was still a dead weight in my hand. As I retraced my steps, the woods felt different. The trees seemed closer together. The shadows were deeper, darker. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see a figure moving between the trees, keeping pace with me. Halfway back to the road, I heard the voice. "Come back." It was a whisper, but it was clear. A dry, cracked voice that sounded like it was being filtered through old radio static. I stopped dead. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing, just the blood roaring in my ears. "Come back," it said again. This time it was closer. My hands were clammy. My mind was screaming that it was a trick of the wind, but I knew it wasn't. The third time it spoke, the whisper was right behind me. Something inside me broke. I didn't think. I just ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, my pack slamming against my back, branches tearing at my clothes and my skin. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care about the direction. I just ran, fueled by a terror so profound it was almost exhilarating. My lungs burned. My legs were on fire. I finally stumbled to a halt, grabbing a tree to keep from collapsing. I was lost. I had no idea where I was. I looked around, desperately searching for a familiar landmark. There was nothing, but I knew that downhill was the only way out. I started moving again, slower this time, trying to be quiet, trying to get my bearings. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a sliver of light through the trees. It didn't look real. It was too pale, too straight. I picked up my pace, then broke into a shambling run. I burst through the final wall of trees and stumbled onto the dirt road. My truck was there, a beautiful, solid metal box of safety. I forced myself to look back. I don't know why. I just had to. At first I saw nothing, just the dark, impenetrable wall of the forest. Then, a shape stepped out from behind a massive oak. It was tall and it wore what looked like an old, dark canvas coat, stained down the front. I couldn't see its face. It was just a silhouette, a man-shaped hole in the world. It stood there perfectly still for a long moment. Then it raised its arm and pointed back into the woods. I didn't wait. I scrambled into the truck, my shaking hands dropping the key twice before I could get it into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires spraying gravel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. When I got back to the station, I turned in my notes and the dead GPS unit. I didn't mention the ruin. I didn't mention the marbles. And I didn't mention the thing that was still out there, in the forgotten darkness of track 14, waiting for someone else to answer its call. "You don't belong here," the voice came out of the darkness. It was a rough, gravelly rasp, like words being forced through a throat full of sand. It was so close to the cabin wall I flinched, my breath catching in my chest. I was crouched on the floor, the kerosene lantern flickering beside me, casting long, dancing shadows. Outside, in the suffocating quiet of the Tennessee mountains, something was circling the cabin, and it was talking to me. My uncle had called me a week earlier. He was sick, and he needed someone to clean out an old hunting cabin he'd inherited. "It'll be easy," he'd said. "Just pack a few boxes." He'd failed to mention that the cabin was at the end of a road that barely deserved the name. He failed to mention there was no power, no water, no cell signal. And he failed to mention that the place was soaked in a deep and abiding wrongness. The drive out was a journey into another time. The pavement crumbled to gravel. Then the gravel gave way to a single dirt track, hemmed in by a forest so dense it blotted out the sky. I passed the skeletal remains of old barns and rusted-out oil drums, relics of a past that had been abandoned and left to rot. The air itself smelled of decay, a mix of damp leaves and something musty and vaguely sour. By the time I reached the clearing, the back of my neck was prickling with that unmistakable feeling of being watched. I cut the engine. The cabin squatted in the center of the clearing, a miserable-looking structure with a warped roof and a porch that sagged like a broken jaw. The yard was just a patch of dead, matted grass, surrounded on all sides by the silent, judging presence of the hills. The front door opened with a gritty turn of the knob. The smell that rolled out almost made me gag. It was stale smoke, rotting wood, and a sharp, acrid undertone that made my throat itch. I found an old kerosene lantern on the kitchen counter, and its weak, flickering flame became my only companion. The linoleum on the floor was cracked, and the walls were covered in dark, ambiguous stains. My plan was simple. Get in, get the stuff, and get out before dark. I started with the kitchen cabinets. They were mostly empty, save for a few rusted cans and the evidence of mice. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. Every creak of a floorboard, every puff of dust, sounded like a footstep behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my nerves stretched tight. After a couple of hours, the oppressive quiet and the stench were starting to get to me. My head felt thick, my back ached. I stepped out onto the porch for a breath of fresh air. That's when I saw the wire. It was stretched between two oak trees at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was an old clothesline. Then I saw the bones. They were small and bleached white, dozens of them. Each one was tied to the wire with a small strip of dark cloth. They hung in a neat straight line, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I walked closer, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The bones were from small animals, rabbits, squirrels, birds, but they hadn't been placed there by an animal. The strips of cloth had symbols drawn on them in what looked like black ink, circles intersected by straight lines, jagged repeating patterns. They were deliberate. They were ritualistic. I took a photo with my phone out of a strange, morbid habit, knowing there was no signal to send it to anyone. I stood there for a long time, just staring at those bones, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. A deep, instinctual part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, but I had a job to do. I went back inside, determined to finish quickly. The sun was already sinking, the clearing filling with long, distorted shadows. I was carrying the last box to the door when I heard it. A heavy crashing sound from the woods. The sound of something large moving through the undergrowth, snapping branches as it went. I stopped, my heart leaping into my throat. A few seconds of silence passed. Then the sound came again, this time from the other side of the clearing. It was circling, and then the tapping started. It began at the back of the cabin. 3 sharp, distinct raps, like knuckles on wood. A pause, then 3 more. My mouth went dry. My rational mind tried to supply an answer. A woodpecker, a loose shutter. But I knew it was neither. The tapping began to move, creeping along the side wall of the cabin, getting closer. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. My hands were slick with sweat. I shut the front door and slid the heavy iron bolt across. I blew out the lantern, plunging the room into near total darkness. I didn't want it to see me. I crouched on the floor, one hand braced against the gritty wood, and listened. The tapping stopped. A minute crawled by, then another, and then the voice came. It was right outside the wall, no more than a few feet from where I was crouching. "You don't belong here." The voice was a low, guttural rasp. My breath hitched. I pressed a hand over my mouth, terrified of making a sound. I heard footsteps in the dry leaves outside, a slow, heavy shuffle. Closer now. "You should leave," the voice rasped again. I forced myself to speak, my voice a pathetic, shaky whisper. I'm just here to pack my uncle's things." There was no reply. The footsteps shuffled away, fading back into the trees. I stayed crouched in the dark, my body trembling, locked in a state of pure terror. Should I make a run for the truck? Or should I stay here in this dark, foul-smelling cabin and pray for morning? Hours passed. The moon rose, casting a pale, sickly light through the grimy windows. I was starting to hope that it was over, that I had imagined it. Then a single heavy thump hit the back wall of the cabin. It was so loud and sudden I cried out. Another thump followed, then another. A steady, rhythmic pounding began, traveling around the outside of the cabin in a perfect, deliberate circle. It was the sound of a massive fist hitting the wood, over and over, keeping a slow, terrifying beat. My hands shook as I fumbled with a match and relit the lantern. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. The pounding stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute. I slid the bolt back and cracked the door open an inch. The clearing was empty, bathed in the pale moonlight. I felt a surge of hysterical relief. Until I looked at the wire, it was sagging. Every single bone was gone, that was it. That was the final straw. I bolted. I threw the door open and sprinted across the porch, my boots slipping on the damp wood. I didn't look back. I hit the side of my SUV with my shoulder, yanked the door open and threw myself inside. I locked the doors and jammed the key into the ignition. As the headlights flared to life, they swept across the tree line. And I saw them. They were standing just inside the woods, dozens of them. Tall, silent shapes motionless between the trunks. I couldn't see faces or features. They were just dark outlines of heads and shoulders against the deeper black of the forest. They were the ones who had been circling. They were the ones who had been tapping. They were the ones who had taken the bones. I stomped on the gas. The SUV lurched and bounced over the rutted track. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew they would still be there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me go. I drove half the night, not slowing down until the buzzing neon sign of a 24-hour gas station appeared, like a beacon in the darkness. I pulled in and just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the sweat on my neck turning cold, waiting for the shaking to stop. waiting for the sound of the tapping to finally leave my head.